All right, we're back with Proclus, commentary on the Timaeus, translated by Thomas Taylor. And I wore a green shirt today, not thinking about my green screen, but that's fine. All right, so I will just pick up where we left off. Critias is about to relate the Atlantis legend, so that's pretty exciting. Socrates, you speak well. But what is this ancient achievement which Critias once heard from Solon, and which is not narrated in history, but was once actually accomplished by this city? Proclus, Socrates, exciting Critias to narration, requests that he would relate the mighty undertaking which the ancient Critias said he had heard from Solon, so Critias the elder, and which, though not much celebrated, yet was really performed. In which this in the first place deserves to be considered, that many things happen in the universe, of which the multitude are ignorant. So just because it's not known to history, doesn't mean it didn't happen. And in this, worthy men differ from others, that they see things of this kind, and understand the events that take place. But it is worthwhile, secondly, to observe that the more perfect causes rejoin in simplicity and proceed from things of a composite nature to such as are first. Okay. The more perfect causes rejoice in simplicity. Okay. Typically, the term would be revert from things of a composite nature back to such as are first. So what is the point here applied to this statement? Next sentence. But subordinate beings, on the contrary, descend from things simple to things composite. For thus also, here Socrates recurs from that which is downward as far as to Solon in an ascending progression, but Critias, on the contrary, descends from Solon to the mention of himself. Okay, so Socrates being worthy begins from... He ascends to Solon, right? Recurs from that which is downward as far as to Solon in an ascending progression. Okay, frankly, I don't get this metaphorical significance in the phrase, and I'm not going to labor it. We kind of understand the pattern as far as how Proclus draws these metaphorical readings out. Sometimes it's a bit over the top, but we like him anyway. Critias, I will acquaint you with that ancient history, which I did not indeed receive from a youth, but from a man very much advanced in years. Longinus here again observes that Plato pays attention to elegance of diction by narrating the same things differently, for he calls the undertaking archaion, but the narration palaios, and the man not a youth. Though, as he signifies the same thing through all these, he might have denominated all of them after the same manner. So, Plato changes up his language to keep things fresh. Possible metaphorical interpretation of multiple terms for similar things is invoking the idea of multiplicity. This is a narration about Atlantis that is supposed to be emblematic of the cosmic enantiodromia, or like war of opposites that give rise to the universal order. So, Proclus isn't saying that, but he might. Longinus, therefore, as Plotinus said of him, was a philologist, but not a philosopher. Oh, so that was Longinus's comment, the keeping the diction fresh, let's say. Longinus, therefore, as Plotinus said of him, was a philologist. Okay. Origen, however, does not admit that Plato is studious of artificial delight and certain ornaments of diction, but that he pays attention to spontaneous and unadorned credibility and accuracy in imitations. So it's not for the sake of keeping things fresh, Origen says, it's for the sake of being accurate in portraying characters. This mode also of expression has spontaneity as being adapted to erudition. For it was rightly said by Aristoxenus, the lyric poet, that the dispositions of philosophers extend as far as to sounds, and exhibit in all things the arrangement with which they possess. Okay, so this mode of expression has spontaneity, being adapted to erudition, I guess because erudite people have a wide vocabulary. The dispositions of philosophers extend as far as to sounds. My first thought on that is that this probably indicates that like vision and hearing are the two elevated senses because they aren't like sullied by sensual contact. So sight is the superior sense and hearing is the second best. The others involve direct physical contact and so are more corporeal. Okay. They exhibit in all things, philosophers, that is, the arrangement which they possess. So they show the arrangement of all things. Just, I think, as this mighty heaven exhibits in its transfigurations clear images of the splendor of intellectual perceptions, being moved in conjunction with the unapparent periods of intellectual natures. Okay, so philosophers exhibit the arrangement of things in sounds, and the mighty heaven exhibits in its transformations the splendor of intellectual perceptions. Okay, so a philosopher's narration is analogous to the world generation of the demiurge. I guess that's the thought. Pretty interesting. The great Iamblichus, however, thinks that we should rather refer the variety of the words to things, and see how in nature contraries are vanquished by the one, how the one is varied, and how great a mutation the same productive principles exhibit, subsisting in one way in the intellect of the universe, in another in soul, in another in nature, and in the last place subsisting in matter. And again, unfolding about matter a most abundant difference in conjunction and similitude. Okay. So the cosmos and these various levels are variegated. So this is just kind of an extension of the same point that he made when referencing Aristoxenus. So Iamblichus thinks the varied diction reflects the kind of multiplicity derived from the one. All right. And again, unfolding about matter a most abundant difference in conjunction with similitude. For these observations are worthy the conceptions of Plato, and not a solicitous attention to diction. So Longinus is being downplayed with his interpretation. I think it's totally fair to speculate that Plato also just appreciated literary flourishes. I mean, he definitely reads that way. Plato, of course, originally wanted to be a poet and wrote poems before beginning to study with Socrates. When he first met Socrates and was impressed, he burned all of his poems and decided to devote his life to philosophy then and there. Okay. Next quote. For at that time, Critias, as he himself declared, was almost 90 years old, and I was about 10. Proclus. These three persons are assumed as having preserved this history or mythology: Solon, the ancient Critias, and this junior Critias, because perfect causes precede the fabrication of the world, and perfective causes are antecedent to the subjects of their government. The elder Critias, however, heard this narration from Solon, one from one. From the elder Critias it was heard by the junior Critias and Amenander. And from the junior Critias 3 persons received it. For the monad proceeds through the dyad to the perfective providence of wholes. Okay, so providence from Proclus's essay on providence comes from the one. The essay is on providence and fate and free will. Fate emanates from a lower principle, but providence comes all the way from the one itself, because providence is bringing goodness to things, essentially, and the one is the good. So that progression of providential attendance from the one proceeds via the indefinite dyad, which is the principle of energy and multiplicity. The numbers also of the ages have much alliance to the things themselves. Okay. So there's some number symbolism somehow in the ages of these characters. For the decad, when he was 10, that is, manifests the conversion of all mundane natures to the one. Because you multiply until you get to 10, and then you kind of revert back to 1. As far as I know, the way that arithmology and numerology was done would have been similar to the way we do it today, where you add up the multiple digits and get the identity by reducing to one of the 9 basic numbers. Pythagoreans believed, in some sense, there are only 10 numbers, and then all the other numbers are like repetitions in some sense of those 10. So anyway, the decad you can see kind of returning to 1 after a progression into multiplicity. And 90, the restitution again to the monad in conjunction with progression. Restitution again to the monad in conjunction with progression. But both numbers are symbolical of the world. This special significance of the number 90, I don't know where he's pulling that from. I'm not going to speculate on why. You may say, therefore, that Solon is analogous to the cause of permanency, but the former Critias to the cause which supplies progression, and the present Critias to the cause which converts and conjoins things which have preceded to their causes. All right, so the elder Critias being 90, 9 is like the largest number, most multiple, so signifying the progression, more so. Solon, younger Critias being 10 at the time, symbolizing that reversion, as we previously discussed. And the first of these, indeed, preserves the relation of a ruling and leading cause, the second, of the cause which comes into contact with mundane fabrication in a liberated manner, and the third, of that which now pays attention to the universe and governs the mundane war. Okay, there is a lot of character symbolism in this one. Proclus generally does this with all of the dialogues. And like Olympiodorus does it as well. It's just part of, I guess, the Iamblichian line of interpretation. This is just something that's done. You got to look for these metaphorical significations of the characters. Next quote. When, therefore, that solemnity was celebrated among us, which is known by the name of Curiotis Apaturiorum, nothing was omitted which boys during that festivity are accustomed to perform. For when our parents had set before us the rewards proposed for the contest of singing verses, both a multitude of verses of many poets were recited, and many of us especially sung the poems of Solon, because they were at that time entirely new. Okay, so let's look up this term. I don't know if I can copy-paste from this document. I can't. So bear with me one moment. Curiotis Apaturiorum. I don't think we're going to get something helpful from this search. It's just Proclus that's coming up. Yeah, it's just Proclus. So, all right, let's see what the explanation is here. Of course, Solon is telling the story. He's just saying when they were all boys, Solon's poems were still popular, so they sang them. And poetry was generally sung. Even the Iliad and Odyssey had like a certain intonation. All right. The Apaturia was a festival sacred to Bacchus, Dionysus, on account of the duel between Melanthus and Xanthus the Boeotian, and the victory of Melanthus through deception, the Boeotians and Athenians waging war with each other for, seems like, is that corrupted, or what is that supposed to say? Oino, kind of strange. All right, so this is the source of this festival. I am going to look up also Melanthus and Xanthus. This is how we do these things. We don't let things just drop from laziness. We do the work. You might say I should have done this ahead of time and been prepared with the answers, but I want to actually get through this book, you know. All right, so Xanthus, he was the god of the river. I already knew that, actually. The river Scamander, or whatever the river name was. And then the duel between the river. Is there another Xanthus? There are actually many characters named Xanthus. Okay, so I need to look up Xanthus and Melanthus. Xanthus, a Trojan warrior and son of Phaenops, together with his twin brother Thun, or Thoon, I guess. They were killed by Diomedes during the Trojan War, and then Xanthus, king of Thebes, the son of Ptolemy, killed by Andropompus or Melanthus. Okay, so this is the king of Thebes, I suppose. We're not going to look too much further into this. This is just briefly mentioned. There's no Wikipedia page about this episode, so tracking it down would take a good amount of time. We will not do that. Okay, so the Apeturia was a festival sacred to Dionysus on account of the duel between Melanthus and Xanthus, and the victory of Melanthus through deception. The Boeotians and Athenians waging war for some time, but this festival was celebrated for 3 days, of which the first day was called Anargusis, I think, because many sacrifices were performed in it, and the victims were called Anagurumata because they were drawn upward and sacrificed. Okay, so there was human sacrifice at this festival, or maybe the victims are not humans. All right. The second day was called Dorpia, I think. For on this day there were splendid banquets and much feasting. But the third day was called Choreotis. For on this day boys 3 or 4 years old were enrolled in their tribes. That's cute. On this day also, such boys as were more sagacious than the rest, sung certain poems, and those were victorious who retained the greater number of them in their memory. That's a really good contest for kids that age. They sang, however, the poems of the ancients. But with respect to the tribes, it must be observed that after Aeon there were 4 families, but from Clisthenes 10, and that after these, each 12 of the families was divided into 3. The tribes were arranged into the same family and company as being allied to each other. The enrollment of the boys was into these tribes, and this day, as we have before observed, was called Choreotis, from the boys that were enrolled. And such is the information derived from history. Again, however, let us direct our attention to things and behold these in the particulars that have been narrated as in images. The festival, therefore, of the Apeturia, which had for its pretext the victory of the Athenians, pertains to the hypothesis according to which the Athenians conquered the Atlantics and all intellectual subdue material natures. Okay. So the parallel between Athenian victory is obvious, and then that's being compared also to the victory of intellectual natures over mundane natures. Deception, likewise, is adapted to mundane forms. which separate themselves from impartible and immaterial principles and become apparent instead of truly existing beings. But the enrollment of the boys imitates the arrangements of partial souls into their proper allotments and their descents into different generations. So the details of this festival weren't even mentioned in the quote, but still, Proclus is drawing on the history of how that festival was celebrated and what was involved in it, and then he's deriving metaphorical significance from that history, which is pretty remarkable. The festival is an imitation of the eternal hilarity in the world, for if it is filled with gods, it celebrates a perpetual festival. I wonder if hilarity had some other archaic meaning for Thomas Taylor. But the contests of rhapsody are analogous to the contests which souls sustain, weaving their own life together with the universe. And the rhapsody itself resembles the above-mentioned woven life of the universe. For this has an imitation of intellectual forms, in the same manner as the contests of rhapsody have of heroic actions and manners, possessing together with a harmonious conjunction a connected series. It just occurred to me that I didn't change my audio. If someone jumps in the Jitsi call, by the way, you can join these by joining the reading group if you want to participate. Other dialogues have been more participatory. This one, we are simply going through Proclus because that's what one does. That's what I do. I think it's worthwhile. So let's see. Going on. In short, let me start back here. The many poems of many poets adumbrate the many natures and many circummundane productive powers, and in short, the division of physical imitations. But the new poems are images of forms which are perpetually flourishing, always perfect and prolific, and able to operate efficaciously on other things, and thus much concerning these particulars. Mention, however, is made of the poems of Solon, not as of a poet in the popular sense of the word, but as of one who mingled philosophy with poetry. For of mundane works, likewise, and whole productions, a royal intellect is the leader, and the praise is related as being mentioned to another person, i.e. to Amminander, because, as we learn in the Phaedrus, that which judges differs from that which makes and generates. Okay. So, being part poet, part philosopher, Solon leads the other poets here. The praise is related as being mentioned to another person. I don't know from the quote what exactly that refers to, but referring, however, all that has been said to the universe, we may infer, as from images, that partial souls, partial natures, and partible forms, and of these, those especially that are always new and efficacious, contribute to the mundane war. But all these are connected together by the gods, who are the inspective guardians of fabrication, and are co-arranged with the one world, one harmony, and one kindred life. So, the world war, nice imagery there, is nevertheless held together and organized and comes to a kind of harmony. The contrary elements create a tonos, tension, wherein this one harmony can subsist. Okay, next quote. But then one of our tribe, whether he was willing to gratify Critias or whether it was his real opinion, affirmed that Solon appeared to him to be most wise in other concerns, and in things respecting poetry, the most ingenuous and free of all poets. Okay, so that's that someone else was referred to as praising, because someone else, like another person, has to judge, then who creates, which is true. That's in the Phaedrus, but okay. in things respecting poetry, the most ingenuous, and free of all poets. Upon hearing this, the old man, for I very well remember, was vehemently delighted, and said, laughing, if Solon, O Amminander, had not engaged in poetry as a casual affair, but had made it, as others do, a serious employment, and if, through seditions and other fluctuations of the state in which he found his country involved, he had not been compelled to neglect the completion of the history which he brought from Egypt, I do not think that either Hesiod or Homer or any other poet would have acquired greater glory and renown. Proclus. Here again, the lovers of diction may indicate to their admirers that Plato cautiously praises the poetry of Solon, since he represents the praise as bestowed by a private individual, right, who goes unnamed, and for the sake of others, and not as given by one who spoke conformably to intellect and reason. Yeah, typically, more esteemed philosophical characters can be treated as a kind of mouthpiece of Plato, but here it's someone who's not named and we have no reason to believe was philosophically competent. For Plato, if anyone, was a most excellent judge of poets, as Longinus also admits. Heraclides Ponticus therefore says that Charillus and Antimachus, being at that time most renowned, Plato preferred the poems of the latter to those of the former, and that he persuaded Heraclides at Colophon to collect the poems of Antimachus. In vain, therefore, is it futilely observed by Callimachus and Duris that Plato was not a sufficient judge of poets. Hence, what is here said, Hence, what is here said manifests the judgment of the philosopher, and it may be considered in a more historical point of view. The investigator, however, of things will think it requisite to show how all the causes of the orderly distribution of the universe, and also the causes that are connective of contrariety, so orderly distribution and the orderly connection of opposites, so it's covering both directions there, kind of in and out, are extended to one principle. So both the connection and distribution are brought back to one principle, and how the last adhere through media to the first of things. Okay. For thus, those who receive the narration of the ancient Critias are extended to him, but he looks to Solon. Okay. Right. That's fine. And he, indeed, admires the poetic power of Solon, but they, through Critias as a medium, are referred to the poetry of Solon. For gratifying the former, i.e. Critias, they praise the poetry of the latter. But what is it that Critias says respecting Solon? That he was subordinate to divinely inspired poets, from these two causes: because he engaged in poetry as a casual affair, and because when he came from Egypt he found the city of the Athenians in a state of sedition, and that he was not able, his country being involved in difficulties, to complete the history which he brought from thence hither. What the history therefore was, he informs us as he proceeds. So this bit about the character symbolism, again, we don't necessarily have to grind our teeth over it too much. We'll just understand, we get the gist of the kinds of analogies Proclus likes to draw here. From these things, however, as images, Plato manifests that what is primarily demiurgic and everything affective have other primary energies, but that their secondary energy is the production of secondary things. Okay. So, what is primarily demiurgic has its primary energy, and then its secondary energy. Secondary energies produce secondary things. I want to see how he applies that. Likewise, that the confused, disorderly, and unstable nature of matter frequently does not receive ornament from more divine causes, but subsists without symmetry to the gift which proceeds from them. Hence, second and third powers are unfolded into light, which proximately adorn its formless nature. Okay, so this relation to principles through mediation, the point I think that he's making is that the lowest natures that are least ordered receive only gifts of these tertiary, secondary, or tertiary effective energies. All right. Solon, therefore, being most ingenuous and imitating exempt causes, did not deliver through poetry the Atlantic War. But Critias, so I guess Solon was above all that. In other words, Solon being here, it goes Solon, elder Critias, younger Critias, and Solon is like the more conjoined unitive principle. Elder Critias was disseminative, younger Critias was revertive. So Solon representing a superior principle shouldn't be disseminating history like this, I suppose. But Critias and those posterior to him transmit the account of this war to others, imitating second and third causes, who produce the variety of effective principles and the orderly distribution of things, which is harmonized from contraries into a visible subsistence. So we've already seen this. Things visible come from contraries in the Phaedo. We talk about the generation of opposites. That particularly applies to the world of generation. In the world of forms, opposites can subsist together to a greater extent because everything is more conjoined and uniform there. But visible natures are produced from a kind of coincidence of opposites, or conflict of opposites, I should say. Higher things have a coincidence of opposites, lower things have a conflict of opposites. Moreover, and yet that conflict yields a greater harmony still. Moreover, the assertion that Solon was the wisest of the 7 wise men exhibits his analogy to the first principles, and his being most free fills all things in a liberated manner. A thing of this kind likewise concurs with the wise man as being immaterial, without a master, and of itself. The ancient Critias, also, being said to be old, indicates a cause which is intellectual and remote from generation. For wisdom, says Plato, and true opinions are most desirable things to him who has arrived at old age. Again, the assertion of Critias that he very well remembers exhibits to our view the salvation of eternal productive powers and the stable energy of secondary causes about such as are first. So he stably disseminates these secondary energies because he's conjoined to eternal productive powers emanating from Solon. A lot of character symbolism here. But Solon engaging in poetry as a casual affair represents to us that productions into secondary natures have only a secondary rank among first causes. Right. So the secondary energies that Solon himself exhibits are obviously not as important to him as his principal energies. For their first energies are intellectual, according to which they are united to the beings prior to themselves. Okay. If, however, some one omitting the survey of things should consider through what cause Plato introduced these particulars, according to their apparent meaning, he will very properly find that they contributed to the thing proposed. For the design of Plato was to narrate the Atlantic War, but it was requisite that the messenger of this history should neither deceive nor be deceived. Hence, also, Solon is said to have been most wise and intimately acquainted with those about Critias. For as a wise man, he was not deceived, and as being an intimate acquaintance, he would not deceive. It was likewise requisite that the receiver of this history should neither have been aged, in order that the narration may appear to be ancient, nor yet so young as to be forgetful. Hence, Critias is supposed to have been a youth, but sufficiently able to remember, and in consequence of this, to have contended with others in rhapsody, in which much memory is necessary. Yeah, that's a good point. It was a contest of memory reciting these poems, and our receiving the Atlantis story now hinges on Critias having a good memory. So Plato includes proof for the strength of the testimony in a fairly subtle way there. I don't think that's Proclus reading too much into it. Farther still, it was requisite that the ancient Critias should not commit such like narrations to very young men, lest they should appear to them to be contemptible. Hence it is very properly said that some one of the tribes, by inquiring of Solon, heard the history. But it was requisite that he also should, in a certain respect, have been familiar with Solon, in order that the old man might opportunely relate all the history to him. Hence, likewise, the praises of the poetry of Solon precede the history, the praise being given by Amminander, in order to gratify Critias, and thus much concerning the disposition of what is said in the text. That Solon, however, went to Egypt, not only for the purpose of obtaining the Atlantic history, but likewise that the Athenians, during his absence, obeyed his laws, which he had bound them by an oath not to violate, is evident, for during this time also he associated with Croesus and sailed to Egypt, but on his return he became master of the city, which was in a tumultuous condition through the Pisistratidae. Pisistratus was a tyrant of Athens during Solon's lifetime, and so I guess these are the followers of Pisistratus who had led to the city becoming tumultuous. There's a letter between Pisistratus and Solon in Diogenes Laertius. And thus much we have delivered from history. Origen, however, doubts how Plato calls Solon most free, for this is not an encomium adapted to a poet. And he dissolves the doubt by saying that he is so called either because he spent his money liberally, or because he used the greatest freedom of speech, and that on this account he was free, without any timidity in his poetical compositions, or he was so denominated as being in his poetry remiss and uncompelled. But Iamblichus says that no one of these solutions is true, but that through this appellation, the liberated condition of the intellect of Solon, the unservile nature of his virtue, and that which was venerable in his character, and which transcended all other things, are signified. Okay, so most free is interpreted in terms of positive liberty, negative liberty. Freedom from constraint is a popular modern view of what freedom means. In the past, to be free was to be ruled by your higher faculties, to subjugate your lower passions. The same interpreter also says that the laughter of Critias manifests a generative progression from causes, perfect and rejoicing in its progeny. So he laughs about the praise of Solon, the elder Critias, kind of one-ups the anonymous guy who praised Solon, saying, if he had made poetry his special focus, he would have been better than Homer. But the laughter, I guess we should remember that laughter could signify progression of multiple causes and the natural rejoicing in your progeny that a creative being receives. But the remembering well indicates the salvation of effective principles in the world. We are going to see kind of physical memory being mentioned. We saw that the kind of regeneration of things, the cycle of rebirth of physical natures, not just souls in the cosmos, is a kind of forgetfulness and remembering in the world itself. And remembering well indicates the salvation of effective principles in the world. And I would guess that's just the emblematic then of that capacity for remembering its own nature that the world itself possesses. Okay. Why, therefore, was Solon anxious to deliver the Atlantic war in verse? Because, says he, all natural works and the mundane contrariety subsist through imitation. For this is analogous to its effective and primary causes, just as Critias is analogous to proximate and secondary causes. But why was he prevented by sedition? Because material motions and material tumult become an impediment, as we have before observed, to the productive powers of mundane causes. Okay. So why was Solon anxious to deliver in verse? Oh, okay, I see what he's saying. The meaning, I think, is that he should have delivered it in verse and completed it in verse as a production, because that's part of the imitative art. If he had just told the story, it wouldn't be part of the imitative art, I suppose. Although in a sense, he'd be imitating the person he heard the story from. But what I'm interpreting here, Proclus saying, is that Solon needed to versify it to mirror the function of nature, in that natural works, the nature of nature, mundane things, subsists through like imitation of itself. Think like morphic resonance concepts, or that like form kind of resonantly amplifies itself, maybe related to the memory idea. I could easily be reading too much into it there, but okay. That would also rely, like, he's speculating on Solon's motives here, but then he's also interpolating the scopos of this dialogue. Like, presumably Solon didn't know that this Atlantis story was going to be used by Plato to be kind of symbolically representative of the nature of the cosmos. But okay, that's enough on that. All right. Next quote. In consequence of this, Amminander inquired of Critias what that history was, to which he answered that it was concerning an affair which ought most justly to be the greatest and most renowned which this city ever accomplished, though through length of time and the destruction of those by whom it was undertaken, the fame of its execution has not reached the present age. All right. Proclus. Longinus says that something is wanting here to render the sense complete, for the word considered is wanting to the words most justly to be, because these are required in what follows, but not the word ouses, being. Porphyry, however, says that Longinus did not perceive that in consequence of the undertaking being the greatest, but not yet celebrated, Plato adds, ought most justly to be most renowned. But we, directing our attention to things, say that Plato calls it the greatest undertaking, as bringing with it an image of all contrariety. Okay. Extending itself everywhere. And so contrariety is great because it leads to great extension. And that he denominates it most renowned as contributing to the visible fabrication of things. Okay. For thus also the works of nature are called by Orpheus renowned. All right. You kind of get the sense that Proclus is looking at the previous commentaries that are available and seeing that other people have commented on a particular issue, and then like someone else commented, and now Proclus feels the need to comment on that same thing. I don't know. It's just funny. I guess it's natural. You know, certain things are picked up on more than others in the history of these commentary traditions. But all right. So, quote from the Orphic hymns: boundless eternity and nature's works, renowned, remain. So the Orphic hymns, who knows the date of this particular Orphic hymn? Probably, 3rd century AD or something like that, just guessing. But that's some support for this interpretation of renown, reflecting the visible fabrication of things. But, all right, next quote. Relate this affair, O Critias, says Amminander, from the beginning, and inform us what that transaction was, how it was accomplished, and from whom Solon, having heard it, narrated it as a fact. All right. Proclus, i.e., relate what this admirable deed was, how or after what manner it was performed, how it became known to, and by whom, being preserved, it reached the hearing of Solon. Plato appears through this to investigate the whole form of contrariety, how it was effected, or may be known, and from what causes, to us, invisible, it is suspended. Okay. So in unfolding the Atlantis story, Plato is giving in images the whole form of contrariety. So depiction of a war, we are looking at the nature of contrariety, which underlies the cosmos in general, from what invisible causes this cosmic war is affected. Before, therefore, he recurred through relatives to the narration of Solon, but now he investigates the superior histories of it, or that I may speak clearer, the principles of the fabrication of this contrariety. Okay, before he had reverted to Solon, and now we are going to see a further reversion to the causes behind Solon, where Solon got the story from. So that would reflect then the principles of fabrication beyond contrariety, I suppose. And by directing your attention to this narration, you may survey, as in images, through certain symbols, all the principles of this fabrication, as far as to the first causes of it. Next quote. There is then, says he, a certain region of Egypt called Delta, about the summit of which the streams of the Nile are divided, and in which there is a province called, this says Saitakal, but it's generally termed Sais, but all right. Proclus. In the first place, it is worthwhile to observe how the narration always delivers things comprehended, proceeding from such as are more comprehensive, delivers things comprehended, proceeding from such as are more comprehensive. All right. From Egypt. Oh, I see. So Egypt is more general than the Delta. The Delta is more general than the individual streams, and those are more general than a particular city on a particular stream. All right. From Egypt, indeed, the river, from this delta, from this, the Saitic province, and from this Sais, sacred to Minerva, Athena. In the next place, having observed this, it will be proper to ascend through the analogy of these things to the first and most comprehensive causes of fabrication. For you may perceive this supernally comprehended by more total causes. The cause of the mundane fabrication is comprehended by even greater eternal causes, and proceeding as far as to the last of things. Right, the generation of the cosmos deals with the very last things on the ontological hierarchy, which are just above matter, which itself doesn't exist, but the most primitive kinds of corporeal natures, which are even termed indefinite in the Theaetetus. So there's definite body, and then there's matter at the very bottom, which doesn't even itself exist, but then between body and matter, there's this indefinite bodiliness, which is an interesting notion. Comprehending causes everywhere proceeding such as are comprehended. So comprehending and comprehended is just generic and specific, pretty much. The more total, such as are more partial, and the impartible fabrication, that which is partible and is denominated recent, to which also the present words refer the father of the narration. And this fabrication indeed is filled from these causes, and particularly participates of the undefiled power of Athena. For in short, since we refer this war, for the sake of which the whole narration is excited, to the mundane contrariety, it will be well, so the war signifies the global war, constituting the cosmos, it will be well, proceeding in the same way, to assimilate all the knowledge of the Egyptian priests to the former, or impartible fabrication, because that's where the story comes from. And so the source of this story represents the supercosmic, hypercosmic forces beyond the demiurge, which stably comprehends the productive powers contained in the universe. But the history of Solon, which is always recent and placed in mutations to the more novel fabrication, and which administers the all various circulations of mundane natures. We shall also be benefited by perceiving how, in images, the difference between human and divine fabrications becomes apparent, and how, in these, Solon indeed calls on the priest to the development of ancient transactions. But the priest knows both such events as are reckoned by ancient by the Greeks, and prior to these, such as are truly ancient. For thus also, in divine fabrications, that which is recent or junior is converted to that which is more ancient and is perfected by it. But the latter, being the more divine, antecedently comprehends the causes of the former, and is established above it by still greater and more perfect intellectual perceptions and powers, and thus much concerning the whole of the text. It is necessary, however, to discuss every particular. With respect to Egypt, therefore, some call it an image of matter, others of the whole earth as being divided analogously to it, and others of the intelligible and the intelligible essence. But we say that in what is here asserted, it is assimilated to the whole invisible order, which is the principle of visible natures. Okay. With respect to Delta, also, it is produced from the Nile, being divided about the Saitic province, so as to make it egress from one right line to the right and left, and to the sea forming the hypotenuse of the triangle, which Plato calls the Saitic province, indicating in what he here says that it is that about which the stream of the Nile is divided. It is, however, analogous to the one vivific fountain of all divine life, and in visible natures to the celestial triangle, which is connective of all generation, being proximate to the ram. Okay, I don't know what that celestial triangle is. Sounds pretty important. Sounds like it's near the constellation Aries. If someone happens to be in here with any... There's one viewer at the moment, so probably not. But this one person who's listening, if you happen to know what that celestial triangle might be, I'm just going to give it a shot. Celestial triangle astrology. There's a spring triangle connecting 3 constellations, but Aries isn't mentioned, so. All right. Okay, so in any case, Sais is where the stream of the Nile divides, and so that's symbolic of the vivific fountain of divine life in the invisible realm, but then it also has a signification in the visible cosmos, namely the celestial triangle, which the Egyptians particularly honor on account of Ammon having the face of a ram, and also because the ram is the principle of generation and is moved with the greatest celerity, as being among the constellations established about the equinoctial. The mention, therefore, of Delta is here very appropriate, since the triangle, as we shall learn in what follows, is the principle of the hypostasis of the mundane elements. Of course, the letter delta is a triangle. It's the principle of the hypostasis of the mundane elements. Yeah, so the substrate of the elements are these 2 triangles. They're in the text of the Timaeus. But the Nile is to be arranged analogous to the zodiac, as being situated under it, having an inclination similar to it, and imitating through its divisions the obliquity of it, and its division about the equinoctial points. So that's interesting. The country of Egypt was said before to be somehow analogous to the structure of the earth. That wasn't elaborated. But then the Nile is arranged, he's saying, analogously to the zodiac, having a similar inclination. I've never heard of that before, but that's something that you can bring up. Proclus says that it was thought the Nile is analogous to the zodiac and has a similar inclination, and imitates the obliquity also, and the division about the equinoctial points. The Nile also is a symbol of the life which is poured on the whole world. Moreover, the two sides of the Nile, which run into the sea from the summit of Delta, may be in a certain respect assimilated to the two coordinations which proceed from one root as far as to generation, and of which generation is the recipient. So that a triangle is produced from them and their common receptacle into which they conjointly flow. The two coordinations which proceed from one root as far as to generation, I assume he means the coordinations of the monad and definite dyad. There's a stream of limitation and unlimitation, or like particularity and universality that extends as far as the last of things. Okay, so that a triangle is produced from them with their common receptacle into which they conjointly flow. But the Saitic province, which forms a great part of Delta, participates also of a great portion of the celestial regions. Sais, therefore, must be sacerdotally referred to the constellation called the Bear, not because it is situated under it, nor on account of its coldness, but as participating of a certain peculiar efflux of the god who presides over that constellation. Hence, likewise, Sais is not shaken by earthquakes in consequence of receiving a firm establishment on account of the place about the pole. So some geography lore about Egypt in this section. Interesting. And let's see. I think we will actually end here now. So there we go. We will keep this up and